Hello, everyone, and welcome to our LinkedIn Live brought to you by IANA and TTX, the rail car pooling experts. My name is Sarah Barnes-Humphrey. I'm the founder and host of Let's Talk Supply Chain and Blended, and I'm going to be your host for this discussion today. Now, it's less than 2 weeks until the event of the year, IANA Intermodal Expo, but it's not too late to get your tickets, so join us for 3 days of networking, education, and innovation. From September 11th through 13th in Long Beach, California, you will be able to discover the latest technology and solutions to enhance your operations and improve your bottom line, and connect with industry leaders, gain insights from experts in the field, and I'll be able to, or I will be there. So come and say hi, because I would love to see you and meet you all as well. So make sure to visit intermodalexpo.com to find out more. All right, back to today's live. And I'm joined once again by three great friends of the show from TTX. So, Peter, I'm going to ask you to start us off. Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are, what you do.
So my name is Peter Wolff. I'm Director of Market Planning at TTX.
Awesome. Trevor, you're up next.
Yeah, so I'm Trevor Gillen. I'm the Director of Economic Planning here at TTX.
Great. And Jerry.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Jerry Vest, Director Market Planning at TTX.
Great. Well, we got together in April earlier this year to talk all about what's happening in intermodal, the trends, the challenges, the opportunities, and we're back by popular demand. That's right. We got so much great feedback from the last time. We wanted to bring Trevor, Peter, and Jerry back to give you all an update. So, what's changed, particularly when it comes to the economy? What can we expect as we look ahead to 2024? And what can businesses do to really prepare? So let's dive in and find out. So one of the key points we discussed in our last live was the status of the economy, interest rates, inflation, talk of a recession. These are issues that are having, a huge impact on businesses and individuals personally. Now, obviously, a recession hasn't happened yet, but there is still plenty of volatility in today's economy. So, Trevor, I'm going to start with you. What has changed since the last time we spoke? Are things improving? Are they getting worse? Are they kind of status quo? Talk to us about where we're at.
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things have definitely changed since the last time we spoke. It seems, every month there's new economic data that's coming out, and it seems like this economic data is always kind of exceeding expectations whenever it gets released. And so whether it's GDP or employment numbers or consumer spending or maybe industrial production, every single month it seems like things are just a little bit more optimistic than people might have previously thought. And so while, even just a couple of months ago, there was a lot of discussion about an impending recession and there's a definite slowdown coming or a pretty significant downturn due to a variety of headwinds that we'll talk about, it seems like the core components of the economy have remained in pretty good shape. And so that's kind of surprised people a little bit. And so it just appears that we're a little bit more on solid footing than we might have originally thought.
Amazing. And thanks for that update. I want to say hi to Mitch and Soleil over on my personal LinkedIn. Mitch, if you click the attend button, we will send you the recording later. So if things are a bit more optimistic now, what has been trending in the right direction? I think you have a couple of slides to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. So on this slide, we've got real GDP or inflation-adjusted GDP. And this is the number that gets reported in the news every quarter and usually dominates the news cycle for a couple of days. And what this shows is the yellow line is the total GDP number, quarter-over-quarter annualized growth rate. And so you can see that actually got revised downward slightly from the 2.4% for the second quarter of 2023 to around 2.1%. And so that just came out recently. So a little bit of a downward revision there, but important to keep in mind that we're still trending in the right direction in terms of these quarterly growth rates, at least especially compared to 2022, where we saw a little bit of a decline, and back during COVID, obviously, when we saw those pretty monumental GDP declines. But so, like I said, obviously, these reports are coming in, these core economic fundamentals are coming in, and they're a little bit higher than people have expected. And as a result, GDP has actually been a little bit higher than people expected. And so now, one of the things that people usually like to talk about when they talk about GDP is whether or not we're in a recession. So if we go to the next slide, you can see this is the National Bureau of Economic Research recession indicators. And really what they track are spending, income, production, and employment. And that's what this chart shows. They're all basically indexed to 1 year, and they're all kind of extrapolated out because it's all wacky data. So to get it all into one chart, you have to show it in an index format like this. And so what this really shows you is all the things that are kind of trending in the right direction, like we talked about. Consumer spending continues to be pretty strong. There's actually some data that came out earlier this morning that we'll talk about. Industrial production dipped a little bit recently, but has actually started to come back up. The labor market, employment has become really strong. I mean, the non-farm payrolls that we add every month is slowing down a little bit, but again, the labor market remains super, super strong. And income levels also is the other one that's tracked here. And we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but income levels are now outpacing inflation rates. So people's wage growth are now kind of mitigating the negative effects of inflation. And so that's been a big news story in the economics world recently. And so yeah, these are the types of, core economic fundamentals that have, exceeded expectations recently. And it's the main reason why we find ourselves in a little bit better footing than we were just even a couple months ago.
Yeah, and it's great to see. I was just speaking on Thoughts and Coffee the other day about an article saying that the inventory landscape is getting healthier. People are seeing new products being manufactured. And I don't know if we're going to talk about this a little bit later as well, but you also mentioned consumer spending, right? Are we spending it on products? Are we spending it on services? I'm sure we'll get into that. But this, obviously gives us some hope from where we were back in April. But let's talk a little bit about what's been trending in the wrong direction.
Yeah, definitely. So if you look at this slide, and it might have gotten the formatting there got messed up, but this is when you look at GDP on that first slide, you can see that we've had pretty solid growth rates for the last couple of quarters, and GDP continues to reach record highs each quarter. But on the flip side, when we look at freight-focused GDP, or what TTX does, is we strip away all of the non-freight related components of GDP, and we just look at things like consumer spending on goods, investment in equipment and residential and structures, inventory changes, and exports of goods and imports of goods. And when you take that and you put that all together, you get what we call freight-focused GDP. And you can see that it's been a little bit more of a different story compared to that headline GDP number. You can see that basically 4 out of the past 5 quarters, we've seen declines. And even that first quarter of 2023 was just a 0.1% increase. So nothing to write home about for any terms of rebound there. But yeah, this is a little bit more reflective of kind of the sluggish, freight environment that we find ourselves in for the past year or so. And so again, taking all of this data and putting it into this one type of index is a really cool way to kind of see that there are certain elements, whether it be, sluggish inventory growth or flat consumer spending or, weak trade, really weak imports have kind of played a key role in pulling this metric down.
And I think you have another slide about the containerized sales and inventory. So let's talk about that, right? Because I just said that it looks a little bit hopeful, right? People are starting to bring in new product after having overflow of inventory.
Yeah, and so just a little background on this slide. So the red line here is inflation-adjusted retail sales for what TTX believes are containerized products. There's a little bit of a list at the bottom there that you can kind of tabulate the different items that fall under this number, but it's a better reflection of what might be traveling by container as opposed to total retail sales or total consumer spending. And then the yellow area is inflation-adjusted inventories minus automotive and minus food and bev. And so again, it's kind of the best approximation that you can get in terms of that containerizable number from an inventory standpoint. And so you are right. There is definitely some improvements being made from an inventories perspective. I know recent reports from Target and Walmart and a couple of other big box retailers have mentioned that they're approaching the pre-pandemic levels of inventory turnover, and they're starting to work through some of that excess inventory. But from a macro perspective, from a total retail perspective, you can see by that yellow line that that inventories are still a little bit too high. And again, that's resulting in weaker demand for imports and freight activity and replenishing those goods at retail stores. And so that's one of the major reasons why we're seeing a little bit of a slowdown there. But the red line is that real containerized retail sales. And one of the other reasons why that inventory number hasn't been worked through quite as quickly as we would like is because for the better part of almost 2 years, that containerized sales number has been flat or slightly declining. And, if you look at 2018 to 2020, what retailers are used to is a slow and steady increase over the years. And so when you're, obviously there's a lot of volatility throughout COVID, but since mid-2021, you've basically seen this really stagnant activity. And I think that's kind of played a key role in mismanaging inventories. And that's the situation that we currently find ourselves in. I will say that you can see basically starting in the beginning of 2023 that this red line has really started to see a pretty sustained increase over the last couple of months. So whether or not this is a signal for a sustained rebound for the next couple of months heading into what would be a peak season is a possibility, but it's something we keep a close eye on. Even this morning, there was, it's a different metric, but the consumer spending number that came out this morning was pretty promising for July. Consumer spending exceeded expectations, particularly on goods, which actually outpaced services spending from a year-over-year standpoint for the first time since November 2021. So we're always campaigning for more goods spending as opposed to the transition we've seen towards services spending. So it's good to see that goods spending growth rates outpacing the services spending.
Yeah, I was going to say the first time in a little while, I think. So that is promising. And this is such great information as people look to 2024, right? They look to forecasting, they look to figure out, they look to do strategic planning, business planning, and so much more. So it's amazing information. Now, I know the Fed has been pretty active lately. Where do you see things going, and what do supply chain professionals really need to know from all this activity?
Yeah, so this definitely represents one of the headwinds that we talk about a lot in the economy. And whether it's other indicators such as the inverted yield curve or the leading economic index or the ISM manufacturing index, these are all typical recession indicators that are in rough shape. And so those are things to keep an eye on. So we talked a little bit about what's been trending in the right direction and what's been trending in the wrong direction. And so one of the things that also represents a pretty strong headwind is what we see on this chart. So obviously inflation has been such a hot topic for a couple of years now, and the subsequent rise in interest rates to combat that inflation has really been one of the main storylines in the world of economics. And you can see that inflation, the red line, that headline inflation number, is continuing to make its way down. So we're seeing disinflation there, which is great. We're seeing things kind of return, hopefully, to that 2% inflation rate goal. And we're also seeing core inflation, which is all items less food and energy, is also starting to come down a little bit. Though that has a little bit ways to go in terms of recovery, simply due to some more stubborn prices, particularly on services. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But the interest rates have been one of the main headlines as well. And so the Fed just even recently talked about how, inflation is still a little bit too high, and that the economic, we talked a lot about the economic data that keeps coming out and how strong it's been and it's exceeding expectations, the tight labor market, things like that. So those are all signals to the Federal Reserve that, we may not be out of the woods. The economy may be a little too hot. We may need to continue the monetary tightening in order to really get this thing under control. And so they have not ruled out any further rate hikes. They could potentially do that between now and the end of the year. But I think we're on the other side of this war against inflation, and I think that you could definitely expect that the rates might come down a little bit in 2024.
Great. Well, you talk about inflation appearing to be somewhat under control. So how does the potential for further monetary policy tightening affect the broader economy with that in mind?
Yeah. So if you go, so this is a great example. So you can see that the higher interest rates, basically what it means, you have less access to cheap capital. And so businesses are going to potentially think about reeling in spending or just overall causing an economic slowdown as a result of these higher interest rates. And so you can see on this chart, the labor market, you've got job openings, total non-farm job openings, which is the red area. And again, that absolutely tanked during COVID when there were not a lot of job openings. People really were stuck at home. But then obviously, once we came out of the pandemic a little bit, the demand for labor absolutely surged. And so we've only just started to come down from those peaks in the last couple of months. And we've seen a more meaningful decline in these job openings, even just from the most recent report, which came out recently. But that's a really good example of the higher interest rates kind of sending a message to businesses to kind of say, hey, we're not really laying people off, because you can see the unemployment rate, which is the yellow line, is still really low. And so businesses aren't really quick to lay people off, because they also remember not that long ago how hard it was to get people to return to work coming out of the pandemic. And so that was a major issue. But at the same time, they're really it's more a reflection of canceling these job openings. And so that's why we've seen that red area come down pretty significantly. And so that's how you could think that the overall tighter financial conditions as a result of the higher interest rates and the bank failures and things like that, that's playing a key role in something like the labor market.
And then I think your next slide is about manufacturing.
Yeah, so this is another good example. You can see on the left chart here, you've got manufacturers' orders for consumer goods. These are items that are showing up on store shelves and things like that, things that people buy. And you can see that the unfilled orders, which is the yellow line, and the new orders, which is the red line, again, both of these have been trending down. There's a little bit of a lag effect there, but both of these have been trending down. And I think that that's a pretty strong reflection of the higher interest rates, which are, combined with the fact that people's preferences for their consumer spending habits shifted away from goods towards services for a couple of years. And so overall, the demand for those consumer goods kind of shifted down. And that's kind of the situation that we see on the right side of that chart. Again, a lot higher than we were from a pre-pandemic standpoint, but definitely a bit of a slowdown. And
then I think the next one is inventories, which we were talking about a little bit earlier. So I'm really interested in this one.
Yeah, so inventories, again, this is one of the big storylines in our world of freight. And so what you can see here is we've got retail trade, the red line, wholesale trade, which is the yellow line, manufacturing, the gray line, and retail trade, thus automotive. So the reason why we take out automotive of that retail trade number is because automotive inventories are historically low. We've got a slide on it a little bit later, but those are historically low. And once you take those out, you can see that retail inventories, when adjusted for inflation, are still a lot higher than they were from a pre-pandemic standpoint. I think it's roughly 17% higher than where they were. And it's also worth pointing out that wholesale trade number is also a little bit too high as well with the yellow line. So again, both from a retail and wholesale perspective, while we're seeing some improvements, like we talked about with those big box retailers, getting their inventory turnover back to a pre-pandemic standpoint, from a macro level, we're still dealing with a little bit of a bloated inventory situation.
Yeah, sort of an overflow. And so you mentioned earlier higher interest rates. How are some of the more, rate sensitive sectors of the economy handling these higher interest rates? And are we expecting, well, I don't know if you can tell us this, but expecting that to go on for a long time?
Yeah, so the two that come to mind are automotive and housing. And so on this slide, we've got automotive, and you can see the gray area is auto inventories, which we just talked about was historically low, and they're improving a little bit due to stronger production, which is seen in the red line. Production has really been able to kind of ramp up recently because the supply chain has really firmed up. There's not a whole lot of semiconductor shortage issues anymore. And so OEMs are really allowed to kind of ramp up auto production to get that inventory back up to where it needs to be. Now, I don't think that gray area, that inventory number is going to get back up to the peaks that we saw in 2014. I think we're going to expect somewhat of a little bit of a new normal with inventories moving forward. But that being said, you still need that gray area, that inventory number to come up just to simply get the yellow line, which is light vehicle sales, up to a level that's a little bit more similar to where we're at from a pre-pandemic standpoint. So that yellow line's been well below trend for 3 years or so now, and simply due to a lack of inventory and the supply chain crisis. When you combine the below trend vehicle sales combined with the fact that by next year, the average age of a car on the road is going to be around 13 years, there's going to be a lot of pent up demand, in my opinion, in the automotive space. And so I think when you combine the production increases that we've seen and the demand for vehicles, I think it's reasonable to assume that despite the higher interest rates, the automotive sector looks to be trending upward.
So maybe those used car prices are going to go down a little bit.
Yeah, so if you look at the inflation numbers for used cars, they're actually declining now. So you don't typically want to see deflation, but that's usually a sign of a weaker economy. But again, that's the used cars are now in that situation where the price is actually declining from a year ago.
Got it. So let's talk about housing. You've got another slide for that one.
So the same can't really be said for housing. Obviously interest rates affect automotive purchases to an extent, but not so much as they do with mortgage rates. And so you can see that once they started raising these interest rates and mortgage rates really started to climb, you can see that the housing starts number, the red line, and the building permits number really started to crash. And there's just a lot of different elements within the housing market, whether it's a lack of existing inventory because people don't want to put their house up for sale on the market because they know they'll be trading in their 3% mortgage rate for a 7.5% mortgage rate. Mm-hmm. So you got an existing inventory problem. And then at the same time, there was a couple of years there where there was a supply chain issue with a lot of home builders and lumber prices were out of control, which really drove up prices of new homes. And so, but now I think a lot of new home builders are looking to take advantage of the lack of existing inventory in the system. And so now that's why you're seeing the yellow line and the red line starting to creep up a little bit here in 2023. They recognize the lack of inventory out there, and they recognize that there's pent-up demand. And as we sort of enter this new normal of higher mortgage rates, I think people are going to kind of come to grips with the fact that, we may be looking at a 7% rate this year, maybe a 6% rate next year, and maybe we get down to 5%, a little bit after that. But it's setting up to be somewhat of a new normal. And I think that home builders are cognizant of that, and they're going to be looking to build houses just to kind of capture that pent-up demand no matter what.
Such great information. Now let's talk about how we take some of that information and turn it into some of that strategy and that planning as we move forward. But as we continue to face some uncertainty, right? Are businesses doing anything differently? Are they changing their strategies, or are we still a little bit hesitant? Like, what are you seeing right now?
Yeah, it's interesting. So a lot's changed since we last spoke, and really, a lot of the economic data that's come out since then has been a lot more positive than we had originally thought. And so all of a sudden, the possibility of a soft economic landing when coming out of this inflation crisis has become a little bit more of a likely scenario than even just a couple of months ago. And so it's really important for people to keep that in mind, whereas a couple months ago, it was almost certain that there was going to be a recession. And now, depending on who you talk to, the possibility of a soft landing or maybe just a very mild economic contraction is potentially the scenario that we might be faced with. Obviously, there's headwinds in the form of tighter financial conditions. The bank failures really kind of screwed everything up. But then at the same time, business kind of continued on as usual. Reduced excess savings from the pandemic and the resumption of student loan payments. Those are going to be headwinds for consumer spending, which represents 68% of the economy. So those are sort of things that you want to keep in mind as you move forward. But on a macro level, business investment and that sort of thing remains relatively strong. There was a brief little bit of a downturn, but it obviously varies from sector to sector. Some sectors are dealing with their own issues, but from an overall, macro perspective, businesses are continuing to invest, and that's why things like the labor market and other elements of the economy have remained relatively strong.
So let's talk about what the economy is going to look like in 2024. How do we budget when we look at 2024 between now and October? What should we be thinking about?
So it's interesting. So if the data that just came out this morning, the consumer spending data, is setting things up to be a pretty positive third quarter. Obviously it's July data for consumer spending. And so right off the bat, it's hard to imagine that the Q3 GDP number is going to be anything, really substantially bad. And that has a lot to do with what we saw this morning. And so the fact that things are going to be looking good going into the third quarter, it's just people are pushing back their forecast for a potential downturn further and further, whether it's in the potentially like in the first half of 2024 or something along those lines. It's just starting to push back that recession forecast or economic slowdown forecast, and also softening or mitigating the potential declines that might happen. But at the same time, you can't really ignore the fact that some tried and true recession indicators still point to that potential slowdown over the next couple of months. The yield curve's been inverted for quite some time, which is has never been wrong in terms of predicting a recession. There's never been a recession without an inverted yield curve that had occurred in prior months. The Conference Board's leading economic index has remained in contraction territory for some time. So you can't ignore these. These are really important metrics that a lot of businesses look at every single month. And it's an important thing to keep your eye on when you go into 2024. So and a lot of what I've been telling a lot of people is that while there are a lot of good things that are happening in the economy and the core of the economy remains pretty strong, there are warning signs that you got to keep in mind and headwinds.
So now you have presented a lot of information. I'm pretty sure people are going to go back and watch this and listen to it just to be able to absorb what you've been able to share with us, because it's really good information for us to be able to plan as supply chain professionals, businesses. What advice would you give to take all of this information that you've provided to us today to help us plan our supply chains, our businesses? What questions should we be asking ourselves?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things really come to mind. And I know Peter's going to talk a little bit, but how are businesses really going to manage their inventory moving forward? Are they going to kind of shift to a just-in-case methodology or just-in-time? I think that's a really important question that a lot of businesses are faced with these days, and how they want to set up potentially a new normal with how they operate. Obviously, we're not expecting an enormous supply chain disruption that's going to cause inventories to plummet like we saw during COVID. It's a relatively safe assumption that things are going to kind of continue on business as usual that we kind of saw prior to the pandemic. So it's kind of safe to operate under those circumstances, that you won't have to deal with a pandemic at least anytime soon, which is good news. Fingers crossed. But yeah, at the end of the day, I wouldn't bet against the consumer. I think that, again, with this morning's report, consumer spending is still churning along. And that has a lot to do with some of the core economic fundamentals we talked about, a really strong labor market and other things like that. But at the same time, it does seem like that the higher interest rates and the tighter financial conditions, might actually start to play a role in a potential slowdown, whether it's an business investment or new orders or things like that over the next couple of months. At least that's what I've been hearing from the economics world.
Well, so much great information, Trevor. And now we're going to turn everything over to Peter. So Trevor discussed the economic underpinnings of intermodal demand. And now, Peter, you're going to discuss the IPI market in more detail. And then we're going to be followed by Jerry, who's going to talk to us about the domestic intermodal market as well. So, Peter, let me ask you the same question I asked Trevor, which is, can you refresh our listeners' memory as to what was happening about 5 months ago during our prior episode, and how is that different from now? But first, before you dive into that, tell us what IPI actually means.
Sure, Sarah, and thanks again for having us on the podcast. Regarding the first question, the letters IPI stand for Inland Point Intermodal, or sometimes they're referred to as Inland Point Intact. And the three-letter acronym is just the railroad shorthand for shipments of the marine containers, the 20-foot, the 40, and the 45-foot containers that are owned and leased by the ocean carriers. You see them when you're out and about. They're painted in the ocean carrier colors. And those containers route inland by rail from ports to interior locations. And that's what refers to as IPI. Regarding the second question, what's going on in the markets now compared to a few months ago, I think the first slide that we're going to look at helps explains all of that. And the red bars, that's containerized imports measured in TEUs, while the light blue table on the bottom shows the annualized import growth rate. And what jumps off the page to me is simply the height of the red bars for 2021 and 2022 compared to all other years. And this illustrates the spike in import volumes that we saw to meet consumer demand during COVID. Broadly speaking, as Trevor mentioned, roughly 68% of GDP is consumer spending. And of that, 2/3 is spent on services, going out to restaurants, going to concerts, buying car insurance, things like that. And 30% is spent on goods. But during COVID, those percentages just flipped. And it was 70% of consumer spending was on stuff and 30% on services. And that's what drove all of these imports is lockdown consumers spent heavily on home goods. And then for this year, the 2023, that's showing imports falling about 12.9%. That's our forecast for the year. When we were on the podcast 5 months ago, I think our expectations were about the same, maybe a little smaller drop, but not much of a difference. And so from an import logistics standpoint, we're really sort of in the middle of the great normalization. It really isn't a whole lot different. Trevor talked about the economy's changed a bit, but from a logistics standpoint and import standpoint, it probably hasn't changed all that much.
Well, and I think before you go on to the next slide, I think we all need to get together on what we're going to be calling this. Because I think the other day I was calling it the new normal or the new normalization. You're calling it the great normalization. So what are we actually going to call it?
Whatever you'd like, I
like yours. Let's go with great normalization.
The great normalization comes from a friend of mine who's a good friend who works at the ocean carrier business, and they're referring to it, I think, is to them, there's a lot less freight moving, so they're feeling it like the Great Recession sometimes.
All right, well, we're going to keep that. That's here to stay.
Yeah, so I think the next slide helps with that. That's slide 20. Yeah, and so what we talked about on our last podcast is the basic equation for transportation demand is simply the underlying demand for the goods being shipped plus or minus inventory levels. And Trevor just spent, the good part of 20 minutes or 25 minutes talking about what's happening with inventories and sales. And consumer spending seems to be holding up pretty well, right? And keep in mind that you have this great normalization where consumers are going to spend more on services and less on goods. So the fact that consumer spending is as robust as it is on stuff is a really good sign. And what the chart shows is if that's going okay, what's happening? Why isn't freight moving, right?
So that was going to be my question, right? If you're saying that consumer spending on goods is holding up, where some people have said it slowed, why are imports actually failing?
Right. And I wouldn't say that they're failing, but they're definitely slowing. And it's because inventory levels are up, right? That's that second half of the equation. And I've been working at TTX for 20 years. I've been in the industry a little longer than that. I really can't recall a time where consumer spending is holding up, but inventories are much greater than spending.
Right.
And so this chart has 5 different colored lines on it, and they represent different types of retail stores. So the purple line, I think, is home furnishing and electronics. The yellow line is home garden stores and home building supplies. Sort of the brownish, grayish line, that's clothing stores. Food and beverage is green, and then general merchandise is red. And you can see right about the beginning of 2020, this big dip in inventories, followed by this really strong run-up as COVID hit, and retailers realized that people are going to be buying a lot of stuff. And so they added inventories as fast as they could, not knowing what sales were going to do and not knowing how their supply chains were going to be disrupted, because COVID impacted a lot of how manufacturing could be done overseas. So they were pulling in 2-3 times more goods than maybe they really thought they were going to sell, but they didn't know if they were going to get any of it in time. So now we have this inventory overhang is really the point of this slide. I think this is a really cool slide. It was really eye-opening to me, and it's all created by Trevor. I had nothing to do with it, but I think the data is really interesting to see. So
I love it. You're getting all the accolades, Trevor. So one of the things that I have not spoken too much about are the low water levels in the Panama Canal. I've been reading about it, but it's not something I've really been talking about. Can you talk about that and what the impact is on shipping right now?
Sure. I think the next slide will illustrate, I think, 2 or 3 things going on at once. So before I directly answer your question, I think the last time we met, there was a dispute going on between port management and port labor on the West Coast.
Yes, there was. Yep.
And every 6 years or so, the labor contract is renewed. The last time the contract expired was actually July of 2022. And looking on the chart, you can see that in July of 2022, there was a pretty big spike in something we call all-water share, which is what this chart is illustrating. And all-water share is just a term that we sort of made up. I think some other people in the industry have used it as well. But it's the share of imports that originate in East Asia that discharge on the East Coast versus the West Coast. And East Asia is a little bit of a made-up region that we would say it's China and then other countries that are nearby China. So it would be South Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan. And so suddenly, instead of having 40% of imports from that region come to the East Coast, that spiked up to about 47% right about the time that the contract ended. And in times past, I've been here 20 years. There've been 3 or 4 times where the contract's been renewed. Not every time, but occasionally there's a bit of a mischief on both sides that have created some disruption, and that has caused some shippers some consternation. So to avoid any problems, shippers have simply moved freight from the West Coast to the East Coast, like I say, last summer. There was capacity to do it as import volumes began to slow down a bit. So this coincides, as you can see, I'm sorry. So you get to, say, March of this year, and you can see that the all-water share number is about back to what it was before the last time the contract needed to renew. And the contract, like I say, in March, you saw the all-water share number come down. The contract wasn't settled in March, but the parties were making nice to each other, and it was pretty clear what was going to happen. And then in June, the labor contract was settled. Now, when I say settled, the union still needs to vote on it, and I think the voting just closed last week, so the results aren't known, but in all likelihood, it's going to be passed. The community hasn't heard a whole lot that the vote won't be positive. So freight started to come back to the West Coast. And about the time freight started to come back to the West Coast, which is a really long-winded answer to your question because I'm never short-winded, this is when you started to see low water in the Panama Canal. And to And the way the locks are fed is they're freshwater lakes that are a little bit higher above the sea level, and they use that water to fill and the locks. And there's been a drought in Panama, and that has lowered the water levels in the lake. So the canal has restricted some transits. Now, I'll say that for now, the transits have been restricted to more to the bulk vessels as opposed to container shipping or to the passenger liners. So more than likely, the low water hasn't impacted shipping. Doesn't say that it would never or couldn't happen later. The other thing is, I like to joke. I was around when Columbus discovered America and the world was considered round, not flat. I'm the oldest in the room. And so before the Panama Canal expanded, which was to create a second set of locks, which were finished off in about 2017, there were a number of vessels that could not fit through the locks. The original locks, a ship that was about 5,000 TEUs. The new locks are good for a 14 or 15,000 TEU ship. So what was happening is the ships would just go the other way and sail through the Suez Canal. So if you can't go through the Panama Canal, you can still get to the East Coast. It doesn't necessarily mean the freight is going to come back to the West Coast, although that could be a possibility.
Well, and as long as it's not blocked.
Right.
All right. So given all of the above information, what do you expect for international intermodal growth? What does that look like? What can we kind of expect?
Right. So I think taking a look at slide 22, and this is similar in format to the slide on the import volume. So again, the red bar is the imports moving inland by rail. That's the IPI. And then the bluish, whitish table on the bottom shows the year-over-year growth rates. And so really the key driver of international intermodal volume is simply the import levels themselves. And so given that our forecast for imports is falling 12.9% this year, we would expect IPI volumes to fall in the same direction. We're predicting a drop of about 8.2%. So not quite as bad as the import volume.
And so do you think that there's any other economic or maybe logistics factors that might be affecting intermodal or international intermodal right now?
Sure. I think there are a couple of things that are going on. That would be the subject of the next slide. And one of the things I like to talk about would be transloading, which also creates a nice segue into Jerry's presentation. He's going to talk about domestic intermodal. But transloading is defined as the transfer of cargo from 20, 40, and 45-foot marine containers into 53-foot containers or trailers. The rail industry refers to as a 53-foot unit as a domestic unit. But because of transloading, a fair amount of domestic intermodal shipments are actually carrying imported goods rather than goods made in North America. And many shippers like transloading because it helps lower inventory carrying costs and enables the repositioning of cargo at the last minute, which supports increased sales. If you're a small shipper who only imports a few containers per month and all of your containers route to one centralized warehouse, transloading probably doesn't do much for you.
Right.
But if you're a medium or large shipper importing a wide variety of goods and have a need to send those goods either directly to stores or into multiple warehouses, transloading offers a number of advantages. And that's why about 40% of the import TEUs at ports of LA and Long Beach transload and route inland by rail. And like about any other logistics practice during COVID, things kind of got out of whack. But now we're seeing sort of the pre-COVID norms returning. And so the way to read this chart is the size of the circle represents the amount of imports coming into a port region. LA, Long Beach, those are actually two different ports, but they're right next to each other and they're commonly referred to as the Pacific Southwest. They're the largest port complex in North America, and there are about 9.2 million TEUs coming into the country through them, at least using the 2022 data. And the red on the circle represents the amount of freight that moves inland intact. That's the IPI move. And then the yellow would be the transload move, moving in a 53-foot container. And all of this is measured in TEU. So it's all measured in the same units. And that's what Jerry's about to talk about will be the domestic movement. And then the grayish, brownish color, that would be the freight that's quote unquote local. And local would mean freight that's literally consumed in the LA area or might get trucked out of the area, maybe to Phoenix or Vegas, things like that, places like that, but doesn't go rail.
Amazing. Well, thank you, Peter. That was a lot of really great information. And now it's time to bring Jerry into the discussion. So before diving into the domestic intermodal market, can you start off by just letting us know the definition of domestic intermodal and then maybe refreshing us on where this market stood when we last spoke in April?
Sure. Yeah. So domestic intermodal refers to a 53-foot container or any size of trailer moving around North America in a rail car. And then looking back 5 months and kind of talking from there and getting us into present day, I really owe Trevor and Peter a big thank you because they set the stage perfectly for me here. It makes my job really easy. So Peter was just talking about, or I'm sorry, Trevor started off talking about how the Fed has been fighting inflation and rising interest rates. Peter talked about the impact that's had on imports. And that all flows directly into the domestic market, along with the inventory correction that's been happening. And we were talking about that 5 months ago. And I think that that's been kind of the story continuing through until today. We're just kind of further along in all of those processes than we were, but a lot of the same talking points. So kind of looking at the market in a little bit more detail, like I just said, a big chunk of the market comes from those import goods that Peter mentioned on the transloading side. So that gets loaded into a domestic container and shipped inland. And then the rest of it comes from goods that are manufactured here in North America. So this first slide covers U.S. containerizable production. So this takes the manufacturing and industrial production data that Trevor talked about in his section, and it really focuses it in onto the goods that would be shipped in a container once it's made. And this is something that we've seen has really flattened out over time due to all of these large macro trends. And it's actually lagged a little bit behind the overall manufacturing sector over the past year or so.
Amazing. So why do you think that the containerizable production index lagged behind overall manufacturing? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So the big difference here has been in the light vehicle manufacturing area. And I think this gives a really nice kind of view into how this containerizable production index works. So when a light vehicle is created, it does pull in a lot of auto parts into that process. And that is captured in this index because those are commonly loaded into containers. But when the vehicle is finished and you have that final vehicle, that is a manufacturing output, but that gets shipped to market in specialized rail cars and not really in containers. So that is not included in this measure. So that's kind of the difference or big driver of the difference between the two currently.
Great. So I think we're going to talk about freight demand indicators next with the next slide, right?
Yes. Yeah. So kind of taking that slowing import activity and the kind of flat domestic production that's out there, we can really see the impacts that's having on just total demand for freight in North America. And one of the measurements for that that's out there is the graph on the left of this slide, which is the Cass Freight Index for shipments. So Cass puts this together using the data that they collect from all of the invoices that they process for their customers, which represent a wide range of industries. And then they use all of the shipping modes that are available domestically. So it gives sort of a nice barometer on where that overall freight market is moving. And what we've seen is in the first 7 months of this year that 6 of them have been a year-over-year decline. So it really ties into that slowing imports and flat production from all the macroeconomic factors that Trevor talked about. And really this started last year. So the declines really started in the last 2 months of last year. So 8 of the past 9 months have posted the year-over-year declines. And then drilling down to a little bit more detail on the right side of this slide is the FTR dry van loading index. And this is focusing on the freight that then is moving into a dry van truck and trailer. And we've seen that coming out of the pandemic, this recovered really quickly. And in fact, through the second quarter of 2022, it was pretty strong growth. And that's where the peak and that sort of post-pandemic on the right-hand side of the graph was the second quarter of 2022. But since then, and looking through the forecast into this year, if we were to draw a trend line on that, it's been a fairly steady decline. Where one quarter might be up a little bit, another might be down, but the overall trend has been a slowing in this dry van loading index. So it matches kind of to the overall view of freight in North America and then to a lot of the macro things that Trevor was talking about. And this has had a pretty big impact on truck utilization. So on the next slide, we can see 2 measures of how truck utilization can be seen. So sticking with FTR on the left-hand side of this graph is a view of active truck utilization in the United States. So on this graph, the red line is the actual results plus a couple quarters of forecast that gets to the end of the year. And then the yellow line is the long run average. That long run average is right around 92% for the utilization rate. And right now we're sitting at about 88%. So you can really see where as the freight started to slow down in the second half of 2022 and through today, the utilization rate has declined. And then the graph on the right is another view of kind of similar data. So this is the Morgan Stanley Dry Van Freight Index, and it's kind of showing the balance between supply and demand in the dry van truck market. So the higher a line is on this graph, the more loads there are per truck in the market. So it would be a tighter market, the higher it goes, and the lower it goes, a looser market. And that's a really small legend. So I'll kind of call out some of these lines on here. The red line with squares is the 2023 line. That royal blue line with circles is last year, so the 22. And then the black line on here with the triangles is the long run average of this. So you can see that red line through the first half of the year is significantly below where we were a year ago.
Right.
And it's been kind of trending in that same sort of range as what we saw in the second half of last year on that royal blue line. So really for about a year now, it's been trending a little bit below that long run average black line that's on there.
Yeah, and I appreciate you pointing that out because it is a little bit small. And that was actually the question that I had for you. You know, considering both of these measures are below that long run average levels, are they expected to trend back to the averages moving forward? What do you think about that?
Yes, I think the consensus is that these will start to move back. It's a little hard to say when, but I think there's some factors that could help push it that way. So one is just on the demand side. So as the inventories normalize and the economy kind of finds a more sure footing, we'll just see more demand for freight, which would certainly drive utilization higher. But I think the other side could be on the supply side for trucking. So ATRI just recently released their annual truck cost study. And looking at that, truck costs have increased by over 30% from 2019 through 2022. So they're facing some elevated costs compared to what they used to. And when you bounce that up against these lower utilization rates, it could just lead to some motor carrier fallout moving forward. So you might have a little bit of a tighter supply, maybe a little bit more demand, and that could push these more up towards their long-term averages.
And I think that takes us into domestic containers on the next slide, right?
Yes. Yeah, so this is pretty much a carbon copy of the ones that Peter showed you. So a couple of years of actual data for the containers and then a forecast for full year of 2023. But again, this is where I kind of owe Trevor and Peter a lunch or a beer or something because they've done a lot of the heavy lifting for me. But all of the factors that they've talked about and that we've talked about in this section are going to flow directly into the results here. So as we're facing some of those macroeconomic headwinds, as imports have slowed, as we've seen the flattening of domestic containerizable production, you're seeing the results in the forecast for 2023 here, with container loadings forecast to decline a little bit under 4% this year.
Well, and it sounds like they're going to be impacted by a lot of the same things as Peter was talking about with IPI, right? Is there anything that is affecting these results that are not really a factor in the international market?
Yeah, I think there's a kind of a unique trend that's happening in domestic intermodal, and that's that some freight over time has been converting from being loaded in a trailer to being loaded into a container. And this offers some big advantages because containers can be double stacked. And for people that are new to intermodal, that's where one container is loaded directly on top of another in a single rail car intermodal well. So it's just a more efficient way to ship that freight. But this is a trend that we've been seeing for some time, and it's continuing to occur, that would lead to a higher domestic container loadings. And then on the next slide, we have trailers. So it'd be kind of the opposite side of that. So maybe fewer trailer loadings as a result. But one of the areas we've seen that this has been really popular over the past several years has been in the temperature controlled segment, where the new slimline containers have been entering the market. So what the benefit of those is all 53-foot containers are the same size and dimensions. So when you stick a refrigerated unit on one end of it, that means you have a little bit less cargo space to load because that refrigerator takes some room. So these new containers just have a thinner refrigerator unit that's capable of controlling the temperature in that container. So it means you can get a little bit more freight than in the older designs on the container. And then it allows them to be used a little bit more like the trailers that have been in this market for some time. And then it also offers the benefit to shippers that they can utilize the full container network versus the smaller trailer network that's out there.
Yeah. And so each one of you have really provided such great insight and information so that supply chain professionals, businesses, supply chains can really plan, right? And forecast for the rest of the year and into 2024. So I want to wrap up and I want to ask each one of you, what would you like to leave the audience with? Do you have a final thought or maybe some action? Maybe it's one thing that people can take action on. So Trevor, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, okay, so I'll keep it really quick because I know we're running low on time. But basically, I'll focus on the consumer. Some key takeaways are that real disposable income, which is a commonly used metric for inflation-adjusted income, has now been growing faster than the rate of inflation for the past 3 months. So this is the first time this has happened since mid-2021. So now the effects of inflation are no longer hurting the consumer as much as they have been, particularly on goods, which are now actually seeing deflation. So goods prices are declining compared to where they were from a year ago. So that's another thing to keep in mind, because again, in the world of freight, we obviously care a little bit more about goods. And so this morning's data shows that consumer spending on goods increased at a faster year-over-year rate than services for the first time, again, since 2021. And so that's another really important takeaway. You combine that rebound in goods sales with the fact that there's been a slight rebound in imports and the possible resumption of inventory rebuilding. And I think it's reasonable to assume that that freight-focused GDP index that we talked about pretty early on, the one that only looks at the freight-related elements of economic data, I think it's reasonable to assume that that may have found its floor, and that the combination of the goods spending and the slight pickup in imports, at least from a growth rate perspective, is going to potentially see a possible rebound over the next couple of quarters. And I think that the potential damage has already been done in that freight-focused GDP, and that you should expect the possibility of a rebound after finding that floor in the last year or so.
Great. Thank you. Peter, what's one thing?
One thing I would say would be the inventory correction, right? And this equation, simple equation, is underlying demand for goods being shipped plus or minus inventories. And as Trevor's talked about, demand seems to be doing okay for the underlying goods being shipped. You just have to wait for the inventories to work their way out. And there was a lot that was been built up from the middle of 2020 to the end of 2022. So it's going to take a little bit more time for that correction to occur.
Great. Jerry, what's your one thing?
So mine actually matches pretty closely to Peter's. So like I said, I think the story's been fairly consistent over the last 5 months. So I think it's just keeping an eye on inventories and what's going on with that domestic containerizable production index and seeing where that moves over the next several months.
Great. Well, so much great information. If you didn't click the attend button, but you attended live, make sure to reach out to us because we definitely want to send you the recording, or you can find it on our YouTube page as well. So thank you so much to Trevor, Jerry, Peter for another fantastic LinkedIn Live. It's always a pleasure. I mean, I cannot wait to see you all again at Expo. And a big thank you to everyone who joined us today, whether you are watching or listening. Go and check out ttx.com for more information on how TTX helps support shippers in a wide range of industries with its rail cars and freight car management tools. And of course, you can also visit intermodal.org to discover a range of industry resources, data, education, and information about the Intermodal Expo, again, which is happening September 11th through 13th in Long Beach, California. Thanks so much, everyone. We will see you again soon. Have a